This is the second lecture on muscles. In this lecture, we'll study the process of muscle contraction in a bit more detail. You'll also be learning about excitation-contraction coupling. So what causes a muscle to contract? Muscles contract when they get an electrical stimulus from a neuron or a nerve cell. This stimulus is known as an action potential, or an AP, and it's generated by the nervous system, specifically by the neuron of the nervous system. The stimulus followed by muscle contraction is called excitation-contraction coupling. The sliding filament theory explains how muscles contract. We talked about this in the last lecture. Let's take a look at excitation-contraction coupling. There's an animation of this process on the following slide. The steps of this process are located on the slide after the animation. This is an animation of the process of excitation-contraction coupling. If you're having trouble viewing the animation, I've also placed a copy under Week 5 materials. The yellow structure at the top is the terminal end of the axon. Remember, the axon is part of a neuron, which is where the electrical impulse originates. That impulse travels down the axon to the end and releases chemicals that will cause the muscle to contract. You can see at the bottom of this the myosin and actin filaments. I just want to give you an overall picture of excitation-contraction coupling and the steps that occur. An action potential or electrical signal develops on the axon of the motor neuron or nerve cell and travels toward the axon terminal. An action potential is when there's a rapid rise and then fall in the voltage across the cell membrane. Now, the next several steps are part of that process, but I'm not going to require that you know it. Let's skip down to the myosin heads. The binding sites for the myosin heads are exposed in this process, and the myosin head binds to these sites and ratchets along the actin filaments. The actin filaments are pulled toward the center of the sarcomere, moving the Z lines closer together. Sarcomeres shorten and all muscle fibers shorten. Again, this animation can be found under Week 5 materials if you're unable to get it to play in your PowerPoint slides. Let's go back and review a few things from the previous lecture. What changes occur in the sarcomere with contraction? The Z lines are closer together. The A bands are the same size, but they're closer together. The I bands are shorter, and the H zone disappears. To the right, the top diagram is a relaxed muscle and the bottom is a contracted muscle. Be sure that you can see each of these differences between the top and bottom illustrations. Here's another diagram showing you again the difference between relaxation and contraction. We've looked at muscle contraction on the microscopic level. We're going to look now at muscle contraction on the gross level. In order to do that, there are some terms you need to know. The first is motor unit. A motor neuron and all the muscle fibers it supplies are known as a motor unit. Each muscle is supplied by at least one motor nerve, and each motor nerve has hundreds of axonal terminals because the axon branches. Take a look at the diagram to the right and be sure you can see these characteristics. In the structure on the right, the blue is the neuron, the yellow is the axon, and the blue branched is the axonal terminals. The red is the muscle. Each axonal terminal forms a neuromuscular junction with a single muscle fiber. When a motor neuron fires, all the muscle fibers it runs to contract. The average number of muscle fibers per motor unit is about 150, but the range is anywhere from 4 muscle fibers to several hundred muscle fibers. What's the difference between fine and coarse motor control? Fine controls, such as you see in the fingers and eyes, are composed of small motor units. This allows more precise control. Coarse control, like the hip muscles, are large motor units, less precise. Fibers in a single unit can be scattered, they don't have to be grouped. When a motor unit contracts, it contracts across the entire muscle and it's weak. Two other terms that are important to know are hypertrophy, which means enlargement of a muscle, and atrophy, which means wasting away of a muscle. Muscle twitch is the response of a muscle to a single brief threshold stimulus. The muscle contracts quickly and then relaxes. Here are the three phases of muscle twitch. First is the latent period, which is the first few milliseconds after a stimulation. It's during this period that excitation-contraction coupling is occurring. No response is apparent on the myogram, which is the graphic recording of a muscle contraction. The second phase is the period of contraction. This is the period from the onset of shortening to the peak of tension. The cross bridges are active during this time, and it lasts between 10 and 100 milliseconds. The third period is the period of relaxation. It's initiated by the reentry of calcium ions into the terminal cisternae. The muscle tension decreases to zero, and it lasts about 10 to 100 milliseconds. This is a myogram, or a graph of muscle twitch. You can see the three periods here. The yellow is the latent period, and this is when stimulation has occurred, but there's no reaction yet. The beige color is the contraction period, and that's when the muscle begins to contract to its peak. Finally, the blue shows you the relaxation period, which is the time in which the contraction relaxes and goes back to baseline. Sometimes there's more than one stimulus. When another stimulus is applied to a muscle before the previous relaxation period is complete, the result is a stronger contraction. They last longer and they are smoother than twitch. There are two ways you can get graded muscle responses. One is to change the speed of stimulation, that is, increase it, make it faster. And the second is to change the number of motor units that are activated. If the stimuli are even faster than they were with wave summation, as in the previous slide, this is incomplete tetanus, and it's when the number of stimuli continue to increase in frequency until the muscle tension reaches a peak point. Can you see where we've increased the frequency of stimuli in the adjacent example? Take a look also at what's marked as trepi. Trepi means staircase, and you can see this in the diagram. Muscle tension increases in a graded manner, and it looks like a set of stairs. There are a couple of points to know. One is trepi. Again, that's the staircase effect, and you should be able to recognize that. The second is trepi occurs for a couple of reasons. More and more calcium becomes available, and as the muscle warms, the enzymes are more efficient. Both of these are reasons why warm-ups before exercise are important. The last term in this series you should know is complete tetanus. Complete tetanus occurs when the stimuli are close enough that the muscle does not rest between stimuli. In this case, we're increasing the frequency of the stimulus. You can see that in the diagram to the right. Here is a comparison of the four terms we just covered: twitch, wave summation, incomplete tetanus, and complete tetanus. Be sure you know the differences. Even when muscles are relaxed, they're still in a slightly contracted state. This is known as muscle tone, and it keeps them firm and healthy. Let's compare the terms isometric and isotonic as they pertain to muscle tone. Let's look first at the term isometric. The prefix iso means the same. Metric means measure or length, so the length of these muscles does not change. The angle at the joint remains the same, and the load is greater than the force, so no work is done. An example of this is posture. In the term isotonic, iso again means the same. Tonic refers to tension or tone, so there's the same tension in the muscle as the muscle changes in length. The angle at the joint decreases, force is greater than the load, and work is done. An example of this could be walking or the exercise to the right. Let me show you another example of the difference between isometric and isotonic. Isometric is an exercise where the load is greater than the force and the angle does not change, so there's no movement. So if you look at the load on the hand, you'll see that it's too heavy for movement to occur and the angle stays the same. In isotonic exercise, the force is greater than the load and the angle would decrease. There is movement. So if you look at this diagram, you can see how small the load is and the fact that the hand can lift it and the angle between the upper and lower arm will decrease.